He wasn't supposed to come back. Not after all those years. Not after the war had swallowed his name and the silence had settled like dust across the quiet mountains of western Montana. But on a cold October night, with the wind whispering through tall pine trees and the porch light flickering against the wooden cabin walls, a German shepherd stood alone in the yard, as if he had finally found the place he had been searching for. The cabin belonged to Daniel Walker, a former U.S. Marine who had spent most of his life learning how to move forward without looking back. The gravel road that led to the property stretched nearly half a mile through the forest, winding past old fences and weathered cedar posts before ending at a small log house built on the edge of a clearing. It was the kind of place where silence lived comfortably. The kind of place where a man could disappear from the world without anyone asking questions. Daniel preferred it that way. At 38 years old, he carried the quiet weight of someone who had already lived too many lives. His shoulders were broad, his posture still straight from years in uniform, but his eyes had changed. They moved slowly now, always scanning the horizon as if expecting something that never arrived. Most nights followed the same rhythm. A pot of coffee warming on the stove, the low creak of wooden floorboards beneath his boots, the distant sound of wind sliding across the mountains. But tonight something was different. Daniel noticed it the moment he stepped out onto the porch just after sunset. At the far edge of the clearing, near the old split-rail fence, a shape moved against the fading light. At first he thought it was a deer crossing the yard. Then the shape stopped. Two amber eyes reflected the glow from the porch lamp. A dog. Large. Still. Watching. Daniel leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and studied the animal for a moment. Stray dogs sometimes wandered down from the hills, usually thin and nervous, sniffing around trash cans or abandoned barns. But this one didn't move like a stray. The German shepherd stood tall and calm, its dark coat stirring slightly in the mountain breeze. No collar, no bark, just those steady eyes fixed on the cabin as though the animal had been there. Many times before, Daniel crossed his arms and let out a slow breath. "You lost, buddy," he muttered into the cold air. The dog didn't approach. Instead it lowered its head toward the ground near the center of the yard and began pawing gently at the dirt. Not frantic digging. Not hunger. Something slower. Intentional. The sound of claws scraping dry soil echoed faintly across the clearing. Daniel watched for nearly a minute, puzzled. The dog paused every few seconds, sniffing the ground carefully before digging again, as if following a memory buried somewhere beneath the earth. The porch light flickered once in the wind. The dog stopped and lifted its head again. Their eyes met across 30 feet of quiet Montana night. For a long moment neither moved. Then the German shepherd took one slow step backward, turned toward the dark tree line, and disappeared into the shadows beyond the fence. Daniel stood there long after the shape had vanished, listening to the wind slide through the pine branches overhead. Finally he shook his head and stepped back inside the cabin, closing the door with a soft click. He didn't know the dog would return tomorrow night, and the night after that. He didn't know the animal had already found what it was looking for. And he certainly didn't know that somewhere beneath the soil in the middle of his yard, a piece of his past had been waiting patiently to be uncovered. The next morning arrived slowly over the mountains, pale sunlight spilling across the frost-covered grass, while a thin ribbon of fog drifted between the pine trees surrounding Daniel Walker's cabin. The cold air carried the scent of cedar wood and distant snow, the kind of quiet mountain morning that made every sound travel farther than it should. Daniel stepped out onto the porch just after 6 o'clock with a steaming mug of black coffee in his hand, the warmth rising into the crisp air as he looked out across the clearing. For a few seconds, everything appeared the same as it always did. The split-rail fence stood crooked along the far edge of the yard. The old truck rested beside the gravel path, and the forest beyond the clearing waited in that calm stillness that only rural Montana seemed to know. Then Daniel noticed the ground. A patch of loose soil sat in the center of the yard, darker than the surrounding grass, as though someone had disturbed the earth during the night. He walked slowly down the porch steps, boots crunching softly over frozen gravel, his eyes narrowing as he approached the spot. The dirt had been scraped aside in a small circle roughly 2 feet wide. Not deep, just enough to expose the darker soil beneath the surface. Daniel crouched down, setting the coffee mug beside his boot. He brushed a gloved hand across the ground and studied the marks left behind. They were paw prints. Large ones. German shepherd size. He leaned back slightly and glanced toward the tree line where the dog had disappeared the night before. The forest stood silent, tall pine branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. Nothing moved. Daniel rubbed his jaw thoughtfully and stood again. Persistent dog, he murmured under his breath. Stray animals sometimes returned to places where they had found food before, but this dog had not asked for food. It had not barked or begged. It had simply dug. Slowly. Carefully. Like it knew something was there. Daniel picked up the coffee mug and turned toward the cabin, but halfway across the porch he stopped again. Something tugged quietly at the edge of his memory. A strange feeling he could not quite name. Over the years Daniel had learned to trust small instincts like that, the kind that surfaced without warning and refused to leave. He walked back down the steps and returned to the disturbed patch of earth. This time he crouched lower and pushed aside a little more soil with his hand. The dirt was dry beneath the frost, packed lightly as if it had been resting there untouched for a long time. Beneath the thin layer of loose ground something darker showed through. Not rock. Not root. Daniel frowned and brushed away another handful of dirt. The shape beneath the soil remained hidden, but it was clear that something was buried there. He stared at the spot for a moment, then slowly stood again. The wind moved gently through the clearing, carrying the faint rustle of pine needles from the forest. Daniel lifted his head toward the tree line once more. If that dog comes back tonight, he said quietly to himself, I might have to let him finish whatever he started. For the rest of the morning, Daniel tried to focus on the small chores that filled his quiet days. He stacked firewood beside the shed, checked the fence along the gravel road, and cleaned the tools hanging on the workshop wall. But every time he stepped outside, his eyes drifted back toward the center of the yard where the disturbed soil waited under the pale sunlight. Something about the place felt unfinished, like a sentence missing its final word. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the soft gray blue that usually meant colder weather was on its way. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the clearing and rattling the loose boards on the cabin porch. Daniel stood at the window inside the cabin and watched the fading light stretch across the yard. And somewhere deep in the woods beyond the fence, unseen in the lengthening shadows of the pine trees, a familiar pair of amber eyes had already returned to the edge of the clearing, waiting patiently for night to fall once again. Darkness arrived early in the Montana mountains, the kind of slow-moving night that slipped quietly between the pine trees and settled over the clearing like a heavy blanket. By 7:30 the last color had faded from the sky, leaving only the faint silver glow of a rising moon behind thin drifting clouds. Inside the cabin, Daniel Walker sat at the small wooden table near the front window, a lantern casting warm amber light across the room, while the steady ticking of an old wall clock filled the silence. The disturbed patch of earth in the yard remained clearly visible from where he sat, illuminated by the pale porch light spilling across the grass. He had not touched it since morning. Something about the place still felt unfinished, as if the ground itself was waiting for someone else to return. Daniel lifted his coffee mug and took a slow sip, though the drink had already gone lukewarm. Outside, the wind moved gently across the clearing, carrying the quiet whisper of pine needles brushing against each other in the forest. For a long time nothing happened. Then, just after 8 o'clock, a shadow appeared near the fence. Daniel noticed it immediately. Years in the Marine Corps had trained his eyes to detect movement long before his mind fully understood what he was seeing. The shape emerged slowly from the darkness. Between the trees, silent and deliberate, stepping into the edge of the clearing with the same calm presence as the night before. The German shepherd had returned. Daniel did not move from his chair. Instead, he watched carefully through the glass while the dog crossed the yard. The animal walked with steady confidence, its head slightly lowered as if following a familiar path. Moonlight revealed the thick, dark coat along its back and the lighter fur around its legs, the unmistakable shape of a working dog that had once known structure and discipline. It was not thin like most strays that wandered down from the mountains. Its body was lean but strong, built with the quiet endurance of an animal used to long distances and patient waiting. When the dog reached the disturbed patch of earth, it stopped and sniffed the ground carefully. The lantern light from the cabin window reflected briefly in its amber eyes. Then the dog began digging again. The sound was soft but clear against the stillness of the night. Slow scraping. Pause. Sniff. Another careful scrape of soil. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair. This time he could see the movement more clearly. The dog was not digging randomly. Each motion seemed measured, almost cautious, as if the animal understood exactly how deep the buried object rested beneath the ground. Daniel stood quietly and walked toward the front door. The floorboards creaked once beneath his boots, but the dog did not react. It remained focused on the small circle of earth in the yard, working patiently under the moonlight. Daniel opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Cold air rushed against his face while the scent of pine drifted through the clearing. For a moment, he simply stood there watching. The German shepherd paused and lifted its head slowly. Their eyes met across the yard once again. Neither moved. The wind stirred gently between them, brushing across the grass and carrying the faint sound of the dog's breathing through the quiet night. Daniel spoke softly, careful not to startle the animal. "You are determined, I will give you that." The dog tilted its head slightly, but did not step away. Instead it turned back toward the patch of earth and resumed digging with the same patient rhythm as before. Dirt gathered slowly beside the hole, forming a small mound under the pale porch. Light. After several minutes the dog suddenly stopped. Its ears lifted forward, and it lowered its nose deep into the hole. Daniel saw the animal's body stiffen slightly, the way a trained dog reacts when it recognizes something important. The German shepherd carefully brushed aside another thin layer of soil with its paw. Then the dog stepped back from the hole and looked toward Daniel again, as if silently inviting him to come closer and see what had been hidden beneath the ground all along. Daniel Walker stepped slowly off the porch, the wooden boards creaking softly behind him as the cold Montana night wrapped around the clearing. The wind carried the sharp scent of pine and distant snow, while the pale porch light stretched his shadow across the grass toward the hole in the center of the yard. The German shepherd stood beside it, silent and still, watching him approach with calm amber eyes that reflected the dim light like small lanterns in the dark. Daniel stopped a few feet away. The dog did not back away this time. Instead, it shifted slightly to the side, almost politely, leaving the hole exposed beneath the porch light. Daniel crouched down and studied the ground. The dirt had been carefully moved aside, forming a shallow pit about a foot deep. At the bottom of it, something dark rested beneath a thin layer of soil. Daniel brushed the earth away with his gloved hand. The object beneath the dirt was leather. Old leather, cracked by time, but still recognizable. He froze for a moment as the shape slowly emerged beneath his fingers. A collar, military style. Thick brown leather with a small metal tag attached to one side. Daniel stared at it without moving, his breath drifting slowly into the cold air. For a long second the night seemed to grow quieter around him. Even the wind between the pine trees felt distant now. He reached down carefully and lifted the collar from the dirt. The leather felt stiff and cool in his hands, dusted with soil from years beneath the ground. Daniel turned it slightly until the metal tag caught the porch light. The engraving was faint, but still readable. Rex. The name sat there in simple capital letters, worn by time, but unmistakable. Daniel's chest tightened as the air left his lungs in a slow breath. 7 years. 7 years. Since the desert heat, the dust storms, and the long patrols across empty ground that stretched for miles under a burning sun. 7 years since the day the military had told him that Rex had not survived the mission. Daniel lowered his head slightly, staring at the collar resting in his palm as memories began moving quietly through his mind. A wide desert sky, the rhythmic crunch of boots across gravel, the steady shadow of a German shepherd moving beside him, ears alert and eyes scanning the road ahead with unwavering focus. Rex had not just been a dog. Rex had been a partner, a silent soldier who trusted every command and protected every step they took together. Daniel swallowed slowly and lifted his eyes toward the dog standing beside the hole. The German shepherd had not moved. It remained there calmly, watching him with patient attention. The animal's chest rose and fell steadily in the cool air while the wind stirred the thick fur along its back. For a moment Daniel studied the dog more carefully than before. The shape of its head, the alert posture, the quiet confidence in the way it stood. Something about the animal felt strangely familiar now that he looked closer. Daniel shifted slightly and held up the old collar in the light. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above the whisper of the wind. The dog tilted its head just a little, as though listening to every word. Then it took one slow step closer to him. The distance between them was now only a few feet. Daniel felt his heartbeat change, a quiet tension rising in his chest that he could not quite explain. He looked again at the collar in his hand, then back at the dog. The animal's amber eyes remained steady, calm, and strangely knowing beneath the pale Montana moon. Daniel Walker remained crouched in the cold grass, the old leather collar resting in his hands while the wind moved quietly through the pine trees surrounding the clearing. The German shepherd stood only a few feet away now, close enough that Daniel could hear the slow rhythm of its breathing. The porch light cast a soft amber glow across the dog's face, revealing details that had been hidden in shadow before. Daniel studied the animal carefully. The ears stood tall and alert. The coat was thick and dark along the back with lighter tan fur along the legs and chest. But what held Daniel's attention were the eyes. Amber, clear, focused. The same steady intelligence he had once trusted on long patrols beneath a desert sun. He looked down again at the collar in his hands. The leather was worn smooth along the edges where a metal buckle had rubbed against it for years. Daniel slowly brushed away the remaining dirt with his thumb until the engraved tag was completely visible in the porch light. Rex. The name felt heavy in the quiet air between them. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath drifting white in the cold night. That cannot be possible, he said quietly, though there was no one else there to hear him except the dog. 7 years had passed since the day the military had told him the search team could not locate Rex after the mission. The official report had been brief and final. Lost during operation. Presumed gone. Daniel had carried the memory for years like a closed door inside his chest. He had buried the collar in the yard himself the day he moved into the cabin, pressing it into the soil as a quiet way of saying goodbye to a partner who had once walked every mile beside him. Slowly Daniel lifted his eyes back toward the dog. The animal had moved another step closer without him noticing. Now the distance between them was no more than 3 feet. The German shepherd lowered its head slightly and sniffed the air around Daniel's hands, its nose catching the faint scent of leather and earth. Daniel remained perfectly still. A strange feeling moved through him now, something deeper than simple curiosity. The dog did not behave like a stray. There was discipline in the way it carried its weight, patience in the way it waited without fear. Daniel noticed something else as the dog shifted its front paw forward. A small scar ran along the fur near the joint, a thin pale line barely visible beneath the coat. His heart gave a quiet, uncertain beat. Rex had once earned a scar in that exact place during a training exercise years ago when a piece of twisted wire had caught his leg. Daniel remembered cleaning the wound beside a dusty supply truck while the dog sat patiently beside him, refusing to make a sound. Daniel leaned slightly closer now, his voice soft but steady. "Easy there," he murmured. The dog did not retreat. Instead it lifted its head and looked directly into Daniel's eyes. The gaze held a calm recognition that made the silence between them feel suddenly alive. Daniel felt his throat tighten. His mind tried to argue with what he was seeing, tried to explain it away as coincidence or memory playing tricks in the dark. But the dog continued standing there, steady and patient, as if it had been waiting a very long time for this moment. Daniel slowly lifted the collar into the light again. The metal tag glinted softly. The German shepherd's ears moved slightly forward when it saw the object. Then the dog took one final step closer and gently lowered its head beside Daniel's knee, resting there with quiet trust beneath the cold Montana night. Daniel Walker did not move for several seconds. The weight of the old collar rested in his hand, while the German shepherd's head remained gently against his knee, warm breath rising into the cold Montana night. The contact was simple, quiet, and yet it carried a familiarity that Daniel had not felt in years. The porch light hummed softly behind him, casting long shadows across the clearing while the wind moved through the pine trees like a slow whisper from the mountains. Daniel swallowed and lowered one cautious hand toward the dog's head. His fingers hovered for a moment above the thick fur, as if his mind still needed proof before his hand could believe what it was about to touch. Then he slowly rested his palm between the dog's ears. The fur was warm and dense beneath his hand, the way a working dog's coat should feel after years of outdoor life. The German shepherd did not flinch. Instead, the animal closed its eyes for a brief moment and leaned slightly into the touch, a quiet gesture of trust that felt unmistakably familiar. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He had done this exact motion 1,000 times before during long patrols and quiet camp nights when the desert sky stretched endlessly above them. His voice came out softer than he expected. "Easy, boy." The words carried into the cold air almost like a memory. The dog lifted its head slowly and looked at him again. Those amber eyes remained calm, steady, and deeply attentive. The same watchful gaze Daniel remembered from years ago when every step through foreign ground had depended on the instincts of the animal beside him. Daniel studied the dog more carefully now. The lines of the face, the angle of the ears, the faint silver along the edge of the muzzle that suggested age but not weakness. 7 years could change many things, but some details never truly disappeared. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the dog's front leg again. The thin scar near the joint was still there beneath the fur, pale but visible in the porch light. His heartbeat grew heavier in his chest. Slowly he lifted the collar he had unearthed from the soil. The old leather creaked softly as he turned it in his hands. The German shepherd watched the movement closely, ears lifting slightly when the metal tag caught the light. Daniel's voice dropped to little more than a whisper. "Rex." The name hung in the night air between them. For a moment nothing happened. The wind stirred across the clearing, brushing through the tall grass and carrying the faint scent of snow from the distant mountains. Then the dog's ears rose forward and the animal stepped closer, pressing its shoulder gently against Daniel's leg. Daniel froze. It was the exact response Rex had always given when he heard his name during training drills or quiet moments between missions. Not excitement, not barking, just calm recognition and silent loyalty. Daniel's breath left him slowly. His mind struggled to keep pace with what his eyes were telling him. The reports had been clear. Rex had been lost during the operation overseas. Search teams had combed the area for hours before the order had come down to move on. Daniel had spent years believing that chapter of his life had closed forever beneath a distant sky. Yet here in the quiet Montana clearing, beneath the soft glow of a porch light and the steady watch of pine trees older than memory, the dog standing beside him felt impossibly real. Daniel lowered his hand again and gently scratched behind the dog's ear. The German shepherd leaned into the touch with quiet contentment, as if the years between them had never existed at all. Daniel Walker remained kneeling in the cold grass while the German shepherd leaned quietly against his leg, the old collar still resting in his hand beneath the porch light. For a long moment neither of them moved. The clearing felt suspended in a kind of fragile silence, the wind gliding softly through the tall pine trees while the distant mountains held the night like an ancient secret. Daniel slowly exhaled, his breath drifting into the air like pale smoke. His mind searched for something solid to hold on to, some simple explanation that could make sense of the moment unfolding before him. But every detail in front of him resisted that explanation. The posture of the dog, the patient calm in its eyes, the familiar weight of its head resting against his knee. Daniel lifted his hand and brushed his fingers along the dog's neck, feeling the thick fur beneath the collar line where the leather once rested years ago. The dog remained still, trusting the touch the same way it had trusted him across thousands of miles of desert roads and quiet training fields. "If this is really you," Daniel murmured softly, his voice almost lost in the wind, "then you took a long road home." The German shepherd lifted its head slightly at the sound of his voice. Its ears moved forward with quiet attention, and for the first time since arriving in the yard the dog made a small sound deep in its chest. It was not a bark, not a growl, just a low breath that carried the faintest hint of recognition. Daniel felt a slow ache build behind his ribs. The sound was another memory pulled from a place he had sealed away years earlier. Rex had always made that same quiet rumble whenever he understood a command or sensed that Daniel was speaking directly to him. Daniel swallowed again and looked toward the dark forest beyond the fence. Somewhere beyond those trees stretched miles of wilderness and silent ridges where winter storms would soon begin rolling down from the north. He tried to imagine the journey this dog might have taken if the impossible truth standing beside him was real. Years of distance, unknown roads, endless nights beneath unfamiliar skies. The thought felt almost too large to grasp. Daniel returned his gaze to the dog and studied the lines of its face again. The muzzle showed faint silver now, a sign of age earned through long seasons and quiet endurance. But the eyes remained the same steady amber he remembered. Alert, loyal, patient beyond explanation. Slowly Daniel shifted his weight and stood up from the ground. The German shepherd rose with him in a smooth motion, staying close to his side, as if the position had never changed. Daniel took one cautious step toward the porch. The dog followed instantly without needing direction, falling into place beside his left leg. The movement struck Daniel like a quiet thunderclap. That had always been Rex's position during patrols. Always the left side. Always half a step behind. Daniel stopped walking and turned toward the dog again. His voice dropped into the same calm tone he had once used during long training drills. Sit. The German shepherd lowered its body immediately and sat beside him, posture straight and attentive beneath the porch light. Daniel closed his eyes briefly as the realization moved through him like a slow rising tide. When he opened them again, the dog remained exactly where it was, waiting patiently for the next word, as though the 7 years between them had been nothing more than a long, silent night. Daniel Walker kept his eyes on the German shepherd sitting beside him beneath the porch light, the command still hanging quietly in the cold Montana air. The dog did not move. Its posture remained perfect, steady and disciplined, the way a trained K9 held position when waiting for the next signal. The wind slipped across the clearing, brushing through the tall grass and carrying the scent of pine and distant snow from the mountains beyond the trees. Daniel felt a slow wave of disbelief pass through him again. 7 years had passed since he had last given that command. 7 years since Rex had sat exactly like this beside him on dusty training fields and quiet desert roads where every movement had mattered. Yet here the dog was now, sitting with the same calm focus as if the time between those moments had never existed at all. Daniel lowered his gaze toward the old leather collar still in his hand. The metal tag glinted faintly in the porch light, the engraved name worn but still clear enough to read. Rex. Daniel felt the words settle deeper inside him now, no longer just a memory, but something real standing beside him in the cold night air. He looked back at the dog and spoke again, his voice steady but softer than before. Stay. The German shepherd remained exactly where it was, ears forward and eyes locked on him with quiet attention. Daniel took 2 slow steps toward the porch, testing the moment the way a handler might test a new recruit during early training. The dog did not follow. It stayed in place without hesitation, the discipline of the command holding firm even after years apart. Daniel paused halfway up the porch steps and turned back. The sight before him tightened his chest again. The dog still sat where he had left it, patient and unwavering beneath the pale glow of the porch light. Daniel walked back down the steps and stood directly in front of the animal again. For a long second, he simply looked at the dog, searching the familiar lines of its face for confirmation his heart had already begun to accept. Then he spoke the next word slowly. Come. The response was immediate. The German shepherd rose smoothly and stepped forward, closing the short distance between them with the same calm precision Daniel remembered from years of working side by side. The dog stopped directly in front of him and looked up, waiting for the next instruction with steady amber eyes. Daniel let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. There was no doubt left now. No coincidence could recreate the quiet language that existed between a Marine and the dog who had once walked every dangerous mile beside him. Daniel knelt down again and reached both hands toward the dog's neck. The German shepherd lowered its head slightly, allowing him to slip the old collar gently back into place where it had once rested years ago. The leather settled against the thick fur as if it had never been gone. Daniel's hands lingered there for a moment, fingers resting against the familiar weight of the buckle and tag. The metal clicked softly as it shifted beneath the porch light. The dog leaned forward then and pressed its forehead gently against Daniel's chest. Daniel closed his eyes as the quiet contact settled into him. The cold wind continued moving through the clearing, but for the first time in many years the silence around the cabin no longer felt empty. Daniel Walker remained kneeling beside the German shepherd while the newly fastened collar rested once again. Against the thick fur of the dog's neck, the metal tag catching faint reflections from the porch light as the cold Montana wind moved softly across the clearing. The dog stayed close, pressing gently against Daniel's chest for a moment longer before lifting its head and looking up at him with the same steady amber eyes that had once scanned distant roads and empty hillsides years ago. Daniel slowly opened his eyes again and let out a quiet breath that drifted pale into the night air. For the first time since the dog had appeared in the yard, the truth had settled into him fully. Rex had come home. The thought felt almost too large to speak out loud, so Daniel simply rested his hand on the dog's neck and stood up slowly. Rex rose with him without hesitation, the movement smooth and familiar. When Daniel stepped toward the porch again, Rex moved beside his left leg as naturally as if they had just returned from a routine patrol instead of being separated by years and continents. Daniel noticed the rhythm immediately, the soft sound of paws across the grass, the steady pace half a step behind him. It was the same silent pattern that had once guided them through countless miles of uncertain terrain. Daniel reached the porch and paused before opening the door. He glanced down at Rex, who stood alert beside him with ears forward and posture calm beneath the porch light. Daniel's voice carried a quiet warmth now that had not been there before. "Let us get you inside, partner." Rex stepped forward the moment the door opened, crossing the threshold into the cabin with a calm confidence that suggested he understood exactly where he was. The warm air inside carried the scent of wood smoke and coffee, the small room illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern on the table. Rex paused just inside the doorway and looked around carefully, his nose lifting slightly as he explored the new space through scent and sound. Daniel closed the door behind them, shutting out the cold night and the whispering wind beyond the trees. For a moment, he simply stood there watching the dog move slowly across the wooden floorboards. Rex walked in a slow circle around the room, passing the table, the stone fireplace, and the small rug near the couch. Each step seemed careful and deliberate, as if the dog were memorizing the place the way he once memorized unfamiliar terrain during missions long ago. Finally, Rex returned to Daniel and sat down calmly near the center of the room, looking up with quiet attention. Daniel could not help but smile faintly. The sight stirred a memory so strong that it almost felt like stepping backward through time. Years ago, after long days of training or patrol, Rex had always sat like this while waiting for the next instruction or signal. Daniel reached down and gently scratched behind the dog's ear again. The German shepherd leaned into the touch with a soft, contented breath. The lantern light glinted softly off the metal tag hanging from the collar. Daniel glanced down at it once more, reading the engraved name beneath the warm glow. Rex. For 7 years that name had lived only in memory, buried like the collar once had been beneath the soil outside. Now the dog carrying that name sat beside him again in the quiet cabin, alive and steady beneath the lantern light. Outside, the wind continued to move through the pine forest under the dark Montana sky, but inside the cabin something long lost had finally returned to its place. The cabin settled into a quiet warmth while the lantern on the table cast a soft golden circle across the wooden floor. Daniel Walker stood for a moment near the door, watching Rex as the German shepherd remained seated calmly in the center of the room, posture straight and attentive as though awaiting the next command. Outside, the wind continued to drift through the tall Montana pines, but inside the cabin the air carried the steady scent of coffee and firewood, a quiet shelter from the long cold night. Daniel moved slowly toward the kitchen counter and filled a metal bowl with fresh water from the sink. When he placed it gently on the floor, Rex approached with measured steps and lowered his head to drink. The sound of water against the steel bowl echoed softly through the room, a simple sound that felt strangely meaningful after so many years of silence. Daniel leaned against the counter while watching the dog drink, his mind still struggling to accept the quiet miracle unfolding before him. 7 winters had passed since the last time he had seen Rex standing beside him. 7 years of believing that chapter of his life had ended somewhere far away beneath a distant sky. Yet here the dog was now, alive and steady, drinking water from a bowl inside the small cabin at the edge of a Montana forest. Rex finished and lifted his head, a few drops falling back into the bowl before he turned and walked calmly toward the stone fireplace. The dog paused near the rug beside it and circled once before lying down, front paws crossed neatly as he settled into a comfortable position. Daniel felt another faint smile appear as he watched the familiar habit. Rex had always chosen warm spots near a fire or heater after long days of work, stretching out quietly while keeping his eyes on Daniel no matter where he moved in the room. The same watchful loyalty remained now. Daniel walked over and crouched beside the dog again, resting one hand gently along the thick fur of Rex's shoulder. The German shepherd looked up at him with calm attention, tail giving a slow single movement across the rug. Daniel's voice came quietly into the warm room. "I thought I buried that collar for good." Rex simply watched him, ears shifting slightly at the sound of his voice. Daniel leaned back against the couch and studied the dog more closely now that the lantern light revealed every detail. The faint silver along the muzzle spoke of years that had passed, but the body remained strong and balanced. Rex looked like a dog that had traveled many miles and survived many seasons on his own. Daniel could not help wondering where those years had taken him. What roads the dog had followed. What distant towns or forests had been part of the journey back here. The thought filled Daniel with quiet awe. Rex stretched slightly and rested his head across his paws, though his eyes never fully left Daniel. The simple presence of the dog seemed to change the air inside the cabin. For years the nights here had carried a certain emptiness, a silence that settled too heavily after sunset. Now that silence felt different, warmer. As the lantern flame flickered gently and the wind brushed against the cabin walls outside, Daniel sat there beside the dog who had once walked every mile of danger and trust with him. Neither of them spoke, yet the understanding between them felt deeper than words. And for the first time in many years, Daniel realized the long quiet nights ahead might no longer be faced alone. The lantern flame flickered softly on the wooden table while the night deepened outside the cabin, the Montana wind brushing quietly along the walls like a distant tide moving through the forest. Daniel Walker remained seated on the couch, his forearms resting on his knees while Rex lay stretched comfortably on the rug near the stone fireplace. The German shepherd had not moved much since settling there, but his amber eyes continued to follow Daniel with the same steady attention that had once guided them through long miles of unfamiliar ground. The warmth inside the cabin slowly pushed back the cold that had settled into Daniel's jacket earlier in the evening, and for a moment the stillness felt almost peaceful. Daniel leaned back slightly and studied the dog again beneath the lantern light. The collar rested naturally around Rex's neck now, the worn leather blending against the thick fur as if it had never left its place. The small metal tag glimmered faintly every time the lantern flame shifted. Rex lifted his head slowly when Daniel stood up and walked toward the kitchen counter. The dog did not rise, but his ears moved forward in quiet curiosity as Daniel opened a cabinet and pulled down a small tin container. Inside were a few pieces of dried beef jerky that Daniel usually saved for long drives into town or cold mornings during winter chores. Daniel broke off a small piece and crouched beside the rug again. Rex accepted it gently from his hand, careful not to snap or rush, chewing slowly while maintaining that same calm presence. Daniel chuckled softly under his breath. "Still polite," he murmured. Rex finished the treat and rested his head across his paws again, though his tail moved once against the rug as if acknowledging the moment. Daniel sat down on the floor beside him, leaning back against the couch while the quiet cabin surrounded them. For years Daniel had lived in this place without much conversation, filling his days with small tasks and long drives into town for supplies when necessary. Most evenings ended exactly the same way, the lantern light glowing across empty walls while the forest outside carried the sounds of distant wind and shifting branches. Tonight felt different. The room no longer seemed empty. Daniel reached over and rested his hand on Rex's shoulder again, feeling the slow rise and fall of the dog's breathing. "You know," Daniel said quietly, speaking more to the silence than expecting a response, "I used to think about you every winter." Rex's ear twitched slightly at the sound of his voice. Daniel continued slowly. "First snow would come down across the mountains, and I would remember those cold nights overseas when you refused to sleep until I did." Rex lifted his head again and looked up at him. Daniel smiled faintly. "You always kept watch." The German shepherd shifted closer then, pressing lightly against Daniel's leg before settling again beside him. The lantern flame wavered gently, casting moving shadows across the cabin walls while the wind continued its quiet path through the forest outside. Daniel leaned his head back against the couch and closed his eyes for a moment. The years between them suddenly felt less heavy. Somewhere in the quiet of the cabin, Something long broken had begun to mend itself again. The night grew deeper around the small Montana cabin, while the lantern continued to glow softly across the wooden walls, its warm light steady against the quiet darkness beyond the windows. Daniel Walker remained seated on the floor beside the couch, his back resting lightly against the worn fabric, while Rex lay close against his leg on the rug. The German shepherd's breathing had slowed into the calm rhythm of rest, yet his ears still shifted occasionally whenever the wind brushed against the cabin outside. Daniel watched the lantern flame move gently within the glass, the small glow casting slow shadows that drifted across the ceiling beams. For years these quiet nights had felt long and heavy, each hour stretching with the weight of memories Daniel had tried not to revisit. But tonight the silence felt different. Rex shifted slightly and rested his head across Daniel's boot, the familiar gesture simple but deeply grounding. Daniel looked down and ran his hand slowly along the dog's neck, feeling the worn leather collar beneath his fingers. The tag moved softly with a faint metallic sound. Rex. Daniel repeated the name quietly under his breath, not because he doubted it anymore, but because the truth of it still carried a quiet wonder. Outside the cabin the forest stretched for miles across the mountains, a wilderness that held countless unseen paths and quiet stories. Daniel found himself thinking about those years again, the long stretch of time between the day Rex had disappeared and the night he had returned to this clearing. He wondered what roads the dog had followed, and what strange towns or empty valleys had shaped that journey. The thought felt almost beyond understanding. Rex lifted his head then and looked up at him again, the amber eyes calm and watchful in the lantern light. Daniel smiled faintly and scratched gently behind the dog's ear. Rex leaned into the touch with quiet contentment before settling his head back down across Daniel's boot. The steady warmth of the dog's presence seemed to anchor the room itself. Daniel leaned his head back against the couch and closed his eyes for a moment. The soft crackle of the fireplace and the whisper of wind outside blended into a peaceful rhythm that slowly eased the tension he had carried for years. In that quiet moment Daniel realized something simple but profound. Some bonds were not measured by time or distance. Some loyalty lived deeper than memory itself. Rex shifted closer again and rested fully against Daniel's side, the large German shepherd finally relaxing into a deeper rest now that he was home. Daniel opened his eyes and looked down at the dog beside him. The lantern flame flickered gently, reflecting off the metal tag one more time. Daniel spoke softly into the quiet cabin. "You found your way back." The words were not spoken with surprise anymore. They carried the calm acceptance of something meant to happen. Outside the mountains remained silent beneath the dark sky, while the forest continued its slow breathing in the wind. Inside the cabin, the long years of waiting had finally come to an end. Morning arrived slowly over the Montana mountains, pale light slipping through the tall pine trees and spreading across the clearing outside Daniel Walker's cabin. Frost clung to the grass like a thin silver blanket, while the sky softened from deep blue into the quiet gray of early dawn. Inside the cabin the lantern had burned low, its glow fading gently as the first natural light filtered through the windows. Daniel stirred on the couch, where he had eventually fallen asleep sometime during the night. For years his sleep had been shallow and restless, broken by memories that drifted through his mind like distant thunder. But this night had been different. The quiet presence beside him had held those memories at bay. Rex lay stretched across the rug near the fireplace, his head resting calmly on his front paws, while his amber eyes watched the room with steady awareness. The moment Daniel moved, the German shepherd lifted his head and stood up smoothly, tail giving a slow sweep across the rug. Daniel sat upright and rubbed his eyes before looking down at the dog. For a moment the memory of the night returned all at once. The digging in the yard, the buried collar, the quiet command beneath the porch light. Daniel reached down and rested his hand on Rex's shoulder. The fur was warm beneath his fingers. Real. Rex leaned gently into the touch, just as he always had after long patrols when the sun finally dropped below the horizon and both of them could rest. Daniel stood up and walked toward the door, Rex moving beside his left leg with the same quiet rhythm that had once guided them through miles of uncertain terrain. Daniel opened the door, and the cool morning air flowed into the cabin. Outside the clearing stretched peaceful and still beneath the rising sun. thin mist drifted along the edge of the forest while the mountains in the distance glowed softly with the promise of a new day. Daniel stepped out onto the porch and Rex followed, pausing beside him as they looked out across the open yard together. For a moment neither moved. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant snow, while a few small birds began calling somewhere high in the trees. Daniel glanced down at the collar resting naturally around Rex's neck. The worn leather and metal tag had returned to their rightful place. Daniel let out a slow breath and spoke quietly into the cool morning air. Some things do not stay buried forever. Rex looked up at him, ears lifting slightly as if understanding the meaning beneath the words. Daniel reached down and scratched gently behind the dog's ear while the early sunlight warmed the clearing around them. The years between them had been long and silent, yet the bond that once tied them together had never truly broken. It had only waited. As the sun rose higher over the mountains, Daniel and Rex stepped off the porch and walked slowly across the yard together, side by side once again. The quiet path ahead no longer meant to be traveled alone.